Hi everybody, this is Christian Shar from SoundFlow. This is a follow-up video to a video I made yesterday where we are trying to build a script for a user called Ben Martin. So Ben wanted help with figuring out an automated way to split all the stereo tracks in his Pro Tools session into mono. And so, for example, in a session like this, if you receive some mono tracks and some stereo tracks, he would like to be able to split these stereo tracks into mono tracks, and then we remove the stereo tracks afterwards. And so in the last video, I made exactly that, and here we've got the script. So first, we get the stereo audio tracks in the session by filtering the tracks list from the Pro Tools SDK implementation. We get their names, then we make sure that those tracks are selected. We then use the track split into mono command up here in the menu, and then that creates the new tracks and selects them. So we'll then go ahead and reselect the original stereo tracks and then delete them, wait for the confirmation dialog, and then click delete. So this all worked in that script, and you can also find the script here on our forum under splitting tracks into mono. So now, after I shared this with Ben, he wrote this reply. I'm glad that he was happy with the first iteration of this. But then he said, "Is it possible to make it detect mono sound in a stereo track? So we would split it into mono only for those tracks that need it." So what I then went ahead and did was I asked ChatGPT for help. So I had a little conversation with it here. I first asked, can I use ffmpeg? I had a couple of spelling errors, but it didn't mind. I had some other suggestions about potentially using a binary compare tool. Then it had a few suggestions, and I tried them out, and they were not really working. So I, had continued the conversation with it, and finally, at some point, I realized it was giving me the wrong argument at some point, and then finally we found a solution that worked. So I've copy-pasted that here. And so the ffmpeg, if you don't know it, is a really useful sort of collection of tools for processing audio and video and other multimedia. I installed it via Homebrew, I'm pretty sure, so we can take a look here. But there are different ways to install ffmpeg. The most important one is that you need to be able to just type ffmpeg in terminal and then run it. And Homebrew, you can install that. You can just Google Homebrew, and then once you have Homebrew installed, you can do brew install ffmpeg. And that's the most normal way to install it on macOS, I would say. We can also type which ffmpeg. That will give you sort of the full path to where that binary is installed. We might need that when we call ffmpeg from SoundFlow, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So the command that it sort of came up with here is you call ffmpeg, then you specify an input file. And here, the one I tested with is lead.vox dual mono. And so that is the stereo file down here, which is actually two identical mono tracks that I just created in Pro Tools just by duplicating a mono track and then sort of moving them into a stereo track and then consolidating it in place. We also have another one we can test with, the acoustic guitar stereo -01, which is composed of two different mic inputs. So these two tracks in the left and right in the stereo track are not identical. So what Ben wants is for us to identify tracks like these that are, that only have the same content on left and right, and only split those. So before we get to that point, we need to first be able to verify that we can create some kind of script using ffmpeg that takes a file and figures out if it has identical content or not. So here we take that input file, then we run it through a filter. We take the first audio stream and then run it through the channel split filter. Then we say the channel layout incoming is stereo, and we want to split it into two labeled streams. So the left stream and the right stream are then taken into the audio mix filter. We say that we're giving it two inputs, and then we give it the weights 1 and -1. So this basically sums together the two tracks with reverse polarity. And of course, if they're identical, you should get 0 out of them. So those two are summed together into the diff stream, and then we take that diff stream and run audio stats on it. Finally, we just tell it that we don't want any formatting, so we don't want to encode that output, and we don't want to pass it to any file. So that's, as far as I understand ffmpeg, this is pretty much what that syntax says. So let's try to take this command and copy paste it into here. So what we can see now here is it gives us a lot of sorry for the noise in the background if you hear that. So it gives us a lot of zeros here, and what that indicates is basically that these two sum to 0. Let's try it with acoustic guitar stereo here instead. I'll just right click here. No, actually, let's just duplicate the code we're running here, the command line, and I'll replace now the file path with this one. So I just hold down Command Option C to copy the path, and then I'll replace the path in here. So now we can run this other example, and we should see something else, because of course these should not sum to 0. So Command K will clear the screen, and then I'll run this, and just like we expected, this definitely gives us very different levels. So let's look at how, how can we use this in SoundFlow, and how can we make sure that we find things like, let's say that what we wanted to use was the max level, and we want to check for the number after that to be 0,00-ish. So what I can do here is I can use grep and then type max level, and that should give us only the lines that we are interested in here. But what grep operates on when I use the pipe symbol here is the standard out. And what is probably happening here is that the standard error output is being used to display the stats. If I remember correctly, we then have to say that the second stream, meaning standard error, should also go to standard out, and then we can grab on that. And yeah, that worked. So let me just take the whole list here. Okay, so that is a much more easy to understand output. We could probably ask ChatGPT if we can get this as JSON. I'm not sure if it's possible, but let's just quickly ask. So I'm always polite to the AI. I don't know if that helps, but it doesn't hurt. I wondered if it's possible to produce the A-stats output as JSON instead, and possibly hide all other irrelevant output, making it easier to parse. Alright, so it sounds like that it actually does not work, but let's see here. I do think, let's see, if we scroll back, if I remember correctly, there was a way to there was a way to configure just the output we want. But basically, okay, so anyway, exactly what I wanted does not seem to be possible, we will still need to do some parsing. So since we can easily do that in SoundFlow, I'll just give up on that simplification. And I think for now what we want to do is just take this command line and then see if we can run it from SoundFlow and start creating a script out of it. We'll also eventually need this little script get file path, which can give us the path of the selected clip in the timeline. So actually, now that we're getting ready for this, let's just run this. This is associated with Control X. So if I select a clip here, acoustic guitar stereo, hit Control X, it will log the full path to that audio file. And of course, this should only work, as far as I understand, if this is a full clip. But the way that Ben received the original content, I think that's likely to be the case. So this should work for him. All right, so let's take this. I'll rename this from get file path to identify dual mono stereo tracks. So what I mean by that, it's not necessarily the best way to name it, but you know, stereo tracks with identical content left and right. All right, so here we get the path. Now I want to define the command line that we want to run. And so I use the backtick symbol here because that allows us to make a string where we can interpolate values inside. And so for example here, we would like to put in the path of the audio file. And in fact, it might make sense to rename this. So let's call it audio file path. And I used F2 to make that rename happen. So you can see here now we construct the command line, ffmpeg, we take the input, we do all the filtering, and we finally run it through grep. So let's see if we can make this work. So I'll go down here, say sf.system.exec to run a system call, and then I'll give it the command line parent property, and then we will look at the result. So that is the standard out of that command, and I'll just call it ffmpeg result for now, and then we can just log that. So ideally this should give us just those couple of lines regarding the max level, and then we will just need to parse those lines. We can just take, you know, the first line and then take whatever is after max level colon and parse that as a number, and then see how close to 0 it is. But let's first see if we can even run this. So I'll select a file here, hit Control X, and indeed it gives us the expected output with a max level here. And we can see we actually get it twice. So let's hope that the lag of a new line here is not a problem, but if it is, we can do some manual string splitting. So let me just see if we start by splitting this. Let me do it as a regular expression, and I'll say I'll split by the new line character, and then we'll log the first item. I'll run it again via Command X, and I think it looks like we do have the problem of the lines ending up sort of on the same line. So what we can do instead is probably just to use the match function instead here. So let's keep the ffmpeg result as a string by itself, and then let's just try to get it out through a regular expression instead. So let's say the max level string is the ffmpeg result, and then we'll use match, and then what we will be looking for is the text max level colon, and then a series of digits and dots, and then that's what we want to take. So I'll do this syntax. So what I'm saying here is the plus means one or more characters, then the square brackets means it's a set of different characters, the \d means it's digits, and the dot means it's the actual literal dot. If I just use a regular dot in a regular expression, it means any character. So here I'm specifying that we want to find this part of the string. And let me just log that here, and then I'll have to remember exactly how we do this regular expression syntax, if we do it with the G or not. Either way, and I also want to put a parenthesis around the whole digit, so the number that we're locating, because that should allow us to fetch the contents just of that group. So let's just run this again, and we can see we get an array, or an array-like structure, and just like I hoped, number 0 will be the whole string that was matched, and the first, or number 1, the second item of the array, will be the text that we matched in that first group. So basically we can just say like this, we index into the number 1, so the second item in the array but the first group, and so now we simply log the string representing the number that is the max level of the sum of the left channel plus the reverse polarity of the right channel. So we can now say, well, the max level, we'll just convert this into a number. And in fact, I'll start by, so in fact I don't need to do any kind of trimming, because our regular expression means we're only getting an actual number here. So what we can finally do is say if the max level is less or equal to a very small number, let's say something like this, then let's say left and right are identical, and if they're larger, we'll say left and right are different. So that should be enough for us to run that piece of script on the acoustic guitar stereo. These are different. Left and right are different. And the lead Vox dual mono, these are absolutely 100% identical. And that's what the script says. Awesome. Right, so we now have to look into how to incorporate this logic that will tell us if the left and right of a stereo clip are identical or not, and somehow get that sort of working together with our logic to split tracks into their mono components. And in fact, let me just delete these two. I don't think we're using those anymore. So there's one sort of caveat with the way that I'm approaching this, and that is you could have a case where you could have a stereo track that both had content where they were identical and where they were different. And I think the way that Ben is likely receiving stuff is just a single clip, a single file in each track. So I'll assume that that's the situation we're dealing with here. And so basically what we need to do is to iterate through each of the tracks, each of these stereo audio tracks, select the first clip, and find the file location of that clip, and then run this algorithm. So let's just try to sort of refactor this a little bit so that we can use this a little bit more in a larger script. So I'll start by this part of the script could be made into a function. So I'll do Command X, and then I'll say are channels identical, and it takes an audio file path, and then it'll return a Boolean value. So here we'll just comment out the logging, and then we'll say yes, they're identical, and here they're different. Of course we could simplify this logic, but it's helpful to read it like this. And so we'll keep this script as it is. Basically, to make this work again, we would have to duplicate the logging here. And so now this script should do exactly what it did before. Let's just confirm that that function will work. So the cello mic, the acoustic guitar stereo here, those are different, and the lead box identical. So here's an interesting example. This track here is one that I manually set up. So it's actually two separate mono files, and I don't think this current algorithm will work on those. Yeah, so it says they're identical, and I think what actually happens here is that it just finds the first of those two mono files and then operates on that. And of course that mono file is identical with itself. So the current algorithm won't sort of properly deal with multi-mono input files. It will expect these files to be stereo. We could potentially look into that later, but for now let's just break this out manually into two mono tracks, because that's how I received the session originally. So let's assume that you know, what we really need to deal with are stereo audio file sources like this. Alright, so we can now start creating a new script here. Split dual mono stereo tracks into mono. It's not the greatest naming. We can call that 3. This was our second attempt, just so we can sort of see the order in which we've developed these. I can now take Control X away from that one and assign it to my new script, because I always use Control X for the script I'm currently developing. Alright, so basically we want to copy some of, or all of this logic from splitting the tracks, but we might want to make some more filtering so that we only perform these steps for the right subset using this logic. Alright, so let's first copy paste that original script. What I like to do in cases like this is to take everything here and put it into a main function. Then I use Option-Shift-F to format the code after I pasted it in. And then here at the end, I'll call the main function. So now it becomes easier for us to separate what's happening into subfunctions. And we can take our channels identical function and copy paste in here as well. Alright, so in our main function, we do want to still start by invalidating the tracks, Pro Tools tracks, in the Pro Tools SDK part of SoundFlow, you could say, sf.apps. Then the first step here after that is that we get the stereo audio tracks. So that's still a great first step, and then we get their names. Now the rest down here about ensuring that those tracks are selected and then splitting them, reselecting them, and deleting the originals, that's something we only need to do once we're sure that we have the right set of tracks. So I'm going to Command X this here and call it split tracks into mono and delete originals, and then give it the argument track names. And now you'll see some red underlines because here in the original code we were expecting a variable named stereo track names, but this function is actually a little bit more generic now. It should be able to take any set of track names. So make sure the tracks in question are selected. So of course they would still be stereo, but my point is, you know, whenever you refactor something, it makes sense to consider if you made something more generic to make sure that the variable names match that new genericness. Alright, so here we now have a to-do. Figure out which of those stereo tracks should be processed. We want to only process those tracks where the first clip of the track contains identical content on the left and right channels. And then finally, split the tracks and delete the originals. So that's our function here, where we'll pass the track names into. So let's look at how can we do this step. So now we have a list of track names that are the candidates, and so right now that would include this track name and this track name. Now we got to find some way to get the name of this first selected file. And if you remember, our code for this used the syntax up here. So now let's create a new script to test this. Get path of first clip on track. And then I'll just use, this time instead of using the mouse to assign the keyboard shortcut, I'll use Command Option K. This adds a new keyboard trigger, and then I'll hit Control X. It will now say there's a conflict because we already used that somewhere else, and then I'll just remove that trigger from the other one. So that's the fastest way to move Control X to a new clip here. A new macro or script. So if I run this again, you'll see that the file filter here, we say what we want the file location for is the selected clips on the timeline. If I hover over this here, we can see that it allows us to get the file paths of many different clips. But we do need some kind of correlation between which track we're on and the clip. So we might need to do some UI automation here. So you can see if I have nothing selected, we'll get an error because I have no clip selected in the timeline. And basically what we need to say is that on this track, select the first clip. So one thing you can do that with keyboard summation is to hit enter or return. I can't remember what it's called. The one that you usually use, not the one by the numeric keyboard. This gets you to the beginning of the track, and then you could use shift, and then so on my Danish keyboard it's a Ö, but I think it's probably the semicolon or colon or something like that. But anyway, it's a 2 buttons to the right of your L, and so that selects the first clip. And right now I'm assuming that these are all starting at the beginning of the track. Otherwise you would have to type things a little bit differently. So let's see if I can make a function that gets us the get audio file path of first clip on track. And then what we give it is a track name. So I'm already putting this in a function now because we want that to return something based on the track name. But to test that function, we'll say track name should be the selected track name. So I'll take the selected track names array and just take the first item. Then we're going to say audio file path, and then we are going to call that function with that track name. And then I'm just going to log that audio file path. So basically, this when we get this working, I should be able to just select any track with no selection in the timeline, and then it should make sure to automatically select the first item and then return the path for that. So we should end by returning the audio file path that we get. And so the first step we need to do here is basically just go to the start of the session and then do this. So because I can't right now think of a better way to do it, and I'm sure there are better ways, but for now I'm just going to use some keyboard simulation. And of course we always want to try to avoid and limit keyboard automation because it's less stable. And just to save time, I'm gonna make some assumptions. We could make the script sort of make sure those conditions are already met, but for now, just to save time, we're going to assume that you have the keyboard focus set here to the timeline, and that link, edit, and track selection is track and edit selection is turned on, because otherwise we might run into problems. Alright, so here I'll use keyboard press because we're using special sort of keys here. Let's try to see if I can remember how to set this up. You know what, actually this is a good example of trying to use the macro editor. So we'll just do test here, add an action, and I'll say press keys. And then I'll hit record. And then I'm going to perform the steps that we want to be included in the script. So I'll say enter to, oh, it's called return actually, to get to the beginning of the track, and then I'll do Shift Ö on my keyboard. This would look different on yours, but it will map to the correct stuff. So now I can take this action and click copy as JavaScript, and this should actually give us the exact code that we need here. Oh, quote, right. So let's just test out if this works. I'll put myself anywhere on this track. All right, looks like it works. And on this track, yeah. So we get those audio file paths exactly like we wanted. I can now take this function and put it back into our main script here. So now we have a way to get the audio file path of the first clip on a track. We have a way to then take that path and figure out if its channels are identical. That's all we need. So I'll remove the to-do designation, and then I'll say track names to process. I'll create a new array here, and that's the array that we'll push to once we loop through the candidates of the stir tracks, and then for each of them, if we identify that it needs to be processed, then we'll add it to this array. So let's do a loop. So I'll use the syntax let off. Off means we iterate through an array. So now I have a candidate, like a stereo track in the session, and we want to figure out, first we want to figure out what is the audio file path of the first clip on this track. So I'll call here audio file path, and then I'll give that name, stereo track name. So I'm now realizing that we probably are missing a step in this file, in this function. Yes, so we are not making sure that the track name that we're passing into this gets selected. So we can do this in more than one way. Let's try to use the SDK version. So we'll say select tracks by name. Then we'll use suggest here, and I'll say track names. I'll create an array and then pass just one item into that array. And we'll have to also define the selection mode to be replace. So this ensures that the track we specify in here will get selected, then we select the first clip, and we get the audio file path for that. Great. And so now all we got to do is to call our other function, which will check if the channels are identical. From that path. So I'm storing that output in a Boolean variable, but I can see that I actually called that Boolean variable the same as the function. That's probably not a good idea. And since we actually, we're going to operate on that result immediately, so I'm just going to add it directly to an if block instead here. So if the channels are identical, this is where we want to push the stereo track name into our array of track names to process. Alright, so this is really everything, I think. I might be missing something, but let's see. So what I want to do to make sure that we don't mess anything up is that I'm going to avoid actually splitting the tracks for now, just for debugging, and just select the tracks we want to process. So we can we can take, we can copy paste this code, and we can say like that. So now we're not going to do any splitting. We're simply going to make sure that the script can take this whole section and then only select the tracks that are stereo tracks with identical mono content. And so right now it should just select this track. But yeah, let's see. There's one more thing. We're going to end up with some kind of selection in the timeline, and because this function here will make a timeline selection, I want to clear that up just to make it a little bit neater. Clear the timeline selection. So because we're using the keyboard already, I think we're good enough to just say we can use that again here. But of course there are different ways to set your timeline selection. Alright, let's try to see how far we've gotten. I'll just run the whole script now, Control X. So it made those two selections, and it ended up selecting just that last track. Now, just to make sure that's not some kind of fluke, let's just position them completely randomly here. Run it again. So it tests those two tracks, and it ends up, correctly selecting just this one. Let's make a duplicate of this, just to make sure that it will now select both of those, because of course they are both problematic, or have dual mono content. You know what I mean? It will now process all three, and it ends up selecting those two that it actually needs to process. Alright, things are going great. And so now the final step is to make it do all of this, and then finally do the split. So let's cross our fingers and hope that it works. Alright, it did it, and it did it very fast. So it left our stereo track that had different content, and it took our mono tracks and split them up. Now, you might be thinking the same as I am, which is, well, now we got them split up, but we actually only want one of those two channels. So let's see here, split tracks into mono and delete originals. So for each of the ones, I actually think this is going to be, this might be a little bit of a longer video. One way, so for each of the tracks that we've selected, that's a little bit of a longer thing to set up, and this video already got pretty long. But so basically what we would need to keep track of is in this function, when we do the deletion, the splitting and the deletion, we keep track of whatever tracks were originally in the session. What we should then do is to look at all new tracks that get created after this point. Only keep every second of those. I think that's probably how I would approach it. Of course, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to work with, because this is not undoable, a lot of what happens. All right, let's try to make it work here. So let's say revert session to saved, and hopefully that is great. That is, I actually had it saved, by chance, right at the right point. Okay, so that allows us to work a little bit on this. So I think for this testing, it now makes sense to skip the first part here, and then just work just on the split function here. So I'll just say let's work on the selected tracks. So I'll say all items filter is selected, and then get their names. So just while we test this, we don't have to run through the whole analysis now. Alright, so this ensures that the tracks we want to process are selected. Then at this point, and of course there are more than one way to do this, but I'm just trying to think of the easiest way to get it done. Remember all tracks in the session. And so I'm going to do a little bit like what we did before. I'm just going to invalidate just to double check that nothing happened, and then we're going to map all the names of the tracks. Then we do the split into mono. At this point, I should note that on newer OSs, menu clicks are handled asynchronously. This happened in macOS Sonoma because Apple rewrote how menus work. So we want to be sure somehow that whatever splitting happens has completed before we then afterwards check which new tracks were created. For now, we might be able to get away with just adding sort of a manual wait. Let's wait a second, for example. That's not something I usually do. But since this is a script you would run once, very rarely, you could also just do something like an alert. Click OK when all tracks are split, and then the script will continue after that. We could also create some more advanced logic that waits on new tracks to be created, and once we see that no more new tracks are being created, then we're fine. In reality, this will probably run in a split second anyway, but we could run into scenarios where if the CPU has a lot of stuff to do, that this would be slightly slower, and then your script could continue before this had completed its work. So let's just try to account for that case here. So now I'm going to say, let's call this track names before, and then we'll call this track names after. Alright. And again, I use invalidate here in both places to make sure that there's no caching happening of the tracks. So what I now want to do, of course, here what we do is that we select the original stereo tracks and delete those. We always want to do that. But in reality, what we want to do, we also want to remove, let's say, all the .r that were created. So if I split lead vox dual mono into the left and right, and I only want to keep the left, then every other newly created track, remember we're processing this on multiple tracks at the same time, every other of the newly created tracks should also be deleted. So instead I'll call this select the tracks to delete, and I'll say tracks to delete. And so right here we'll define tracks to delete. And in fact, instead of an empty array, we can start by saying, well, it should be the track names and then .slice. .slice will create a copy of that original array. So then tracks to delete, as a minimum, we'll delete the stereo tracks, and then we'll also add some more to that. So here, first what we want to do is we want to get all the tracks that were created. And of course, we could try to use some kind of like .l, .r logic, but what if Pro Tools changes how it renames the tracks, or what if there's some kind of custom logic in Pro Tools? Anyway, so we're trying to avoid that part here. So first, let's get all the newly added tracks. Let's get the names of all the newly added tracks. So I think JavaScript has some kind of set stuff, like you can do new set. I can't remember. You can probably do intersections. Let me see if we take the track names after and filter them, and then say for each that exists now, ensure that it didn't exist before. So we filtered that track names after, and then for each of those items we get the track name here, the T. then I want to ensure that track names before does not include this T. So I'll say not track names before some, and like this. So this is the kind of stuff where, you know, we might even like ask ChatGPT if this is the correct way to do it. Since it's a little bit hairy, let's just copy paste this out into a little test script. Test 2. I'll give it Control X, and we can double check that my logic is sound. So let's say what we had before was audio 1, audio 2. And then after the split, we would have audio 1, audio 1 left, audio 1 right, audio 2. Let's say only audio 1 was split into something. And then what we want to make sure is that newly created track names would only contain those two. And let's just run it again. Yes. All right. So this logic is sound in order to like find the new items. And I'm sure, by the way, that there's a lot of better ways to do that. All right. So let's get back here, and I'll add Control X again to this. So now we've got the newly created track names. And remember, we own every second of them. We want to add to tracks to delete, so all the .r's basically. The way I'll do this now is just to do a for loop, and I'll loop through everything in that array. And then what I'll do is I'll say if I modulus 2 equals 1. So I modulus 2 means basically divide I by 2, and then we take the remainder. I think it's called remainder. So basically this is saying, is I odd? Is it 1 or 3 or 5 or 7? And that should allow us to say every .r. So I'll say here tracks to delete, push, and then we'll take that track name. We'll just index it directly here, and then add it to tracks to delete. Alright, so because we want to test this we're testing it right now just with the selected track names. We want to do the split, but not necessarily all the deletion. So we can use throw 0 in SoundFlow to break the script at that point. So we're just debugging this part of the script right now. And here I want to we want to say tracks to delete. That's what we want to log. So that should then give us, as a matter of fact, I think, no, okay, let's do this. Let's log the tracks to delete. This should then contain the stereo tracks that we had selected and all the .r's. And this actually will split. So we'll do a save. I make sure the Control X is on the script. Then because we're testing with without doing the detection, so we just have to select all the tracks to process, and that of course would be this track and this track. And then we'll hit Control X. This will perform the split, show up the alert dialog for me to press OK, and then it will show us which tracks it wants to delete. Control X. Alright. So we can now see it wants to delete lead vox dual mono .dup1 .r and .dup1 .r. So the two first ones are, that's the stereo track, and this is the duplicate of the stereo track that we made down here. And then it wants to delete the .r of that, and it wants to delete the .r up here. So I think that actually is exactly what we wanted. So let's say here, revert session to saved. Alright, we've got it here. And then I think now we're ready to activate everything. I'll remove the comments here using Option Shift A for block comments, and I'll remove that initial thing there. And this, of course, like we could always just add a manual wait or some more complex logic, but I'll keep it in here because it should make it a little bit more stable. So now I think we have a full script. All right, so let's look at this again and talk about what we expect it to do. So basically, it should take lead vox dual mono, give me only one of those two tracks, and down here, give me only one of those two tracks, and leave everything else as it is. Let's run it. First, it does its analysis. It does the split. I'll just hit OK. And then it deletes everything again. And voila, we've got just one of those two mono tracks and just one of those two mono tracks. And this was left alone. Awesome. So that was quite the ordeal. If you've watched this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that most of what I did made sense. Of course, I'll take this script and post again out on this forum post as a follow-up. If you have any questions, please go ahead and find this and comment down below. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.